Let's do Charlie.
Charlie in Jerusalem. Thanks for waiting. You're on with V and Matt.
Hey, how you doing, V and Matt?
I'm told
Very
you
good.
you have a definition of God and a proof for God's non-existence?
No, not exactly. I have a question about definitions of God.
Okay, cool.
So I am an atheist. I've been an atheist for the last 3 or 4 years. I grew up in a religious home. So I want to say, excuse me for my English. My English is not perfect, so you can.
It's probably better than mine. Keep right on going.
Okay. So I usually I love talking about God and atheism and theism religions. But I think in the last couple of years, I've been struggling with definitions of God. So I love philosophy too, and I know the definition, let's say, of Descartes in the Meditations, that he defines God very simply as all-knowing, all good, and all those kind of stuff. But what I'm talking about is more of a definition of a philosophical, mystical God, not a person or something like that. So I was just wondering, do you have like a philosophical, mystical definition of God?
No. Usually the
No.
correct way would probably be to ask the other person who has a God belief what they define God as, because I don't believe in any of
I'm going to stop talking for a while because that is exactly what I was going to say. There are God concepts in my head. Some of them are left over from when I believed. Some of them are things that have been presented by other people. But I don't have a default God definition other than if somebody says, oh, I believe in God, and you say, okay, define this God for me.
Right.
And they say, it's this soft drink. I'm going to say, okay, I can appreciate the fact that that's what you want to call God, but it's so far from any normative use that I don't know why you would add that baggage to your soft drink. Other than that, I'll just go with whatever definition the person I'm talking to wants to use.
Sure. So that's what usually I do. When I have a conversation with someone about God, I usually ask them, what do you mean exactly by God? And that's where we usually end the conversation. But I have been thinking about an argument for the non-existence of God lately.
Well, you can always do that for the God of classical theism. Mm-hmm. You know, there are normative definitions even within philosophy where you're talking about the greatest possible being or a creator God or something that's, you know, the omnimax, whatever. So the God of classical theism, you could certainly come up with arguments against its existence, and people have done so. So what have you got?
Sure. So my argument, I'll first try to line that out logically. I've studied math and logic for a while. So the argument, the structure of the argument will probably be something like, if there is God, then there is no God. And then the conclusion would have to be, then there is no God. And I think that's a valid argument. Although I will have to prove my premise that if there is a God, then there is no God. Is that okay?
No.
Up to now?
So
okay.
While I will say that if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're not wrong. The way it's phrased, the first premise would be, first of all, you need two premises for a syllogism, essentially, but the first premise would be contradictory, and so I worry that there is an equivocation fallacy between the two. Because if you say, if there is God, then there's no God, you're assuming there is a God in order to show there's not a God, so you end up with the rough equivalent of like the liar's paradox.
Also, like A cannot equal B,
yeah.
And like the law of non-contradiction.
If A, then not A is not a valid premise.
I see. So let me just try to clarify that up. So once again, my premise would be, logically speaking, something like if P, then not P.
Which is already a problem.
Stands for.
Right. But go ahead, right. But it's already a problem.
Right. So, okay. So let's assume that is not a problem, but I will get to that in a minute. I think logically, if I do only have one premise, then the conclusion of the premise P, therefore not P, would be not P. Using a pretty simple calculus of logic or something like that. But what I would have to show is that the opposite is false. In other words, that if there is no, right, if not P, then P, that must be false, or else I'll fall into some circle.
You fell into a circle at the first premise. If you say if P, then not P, that's like saying if I'm telling the truth, then I'm lying.
Right.
Or actually, to more accurately, it would be if I'm telling the truth, then I'm not telling the truth. And so you've set up a contradiction that can't be, and there's nothing you can derive from it. Which is why even if we're not doing like Aristotelian syllogisms, you would still do if P then Q, P therefore Q. Boom, you've got a valid structure. Mm-hmm. Now, if Q is set equal to not P, which is what you're doing, then you have if P then not P, P therefore not P, and there's nothing about that is a valid syllogism.
Right. So I'm not saying that P equals not P. I'm saying that if P, then not P, right?
I didn't say you said P equals not P. I said if P, then Q, P, right, therefore Q. So, right, but you're saying that Q equals not P.
No, I'm not saying it equals. I'm saying it implies not P.
Okay. That's already a problem. That's like saying if I'm telling the truth, it implies I'm not telling the truth. You're never going to get there using the thing you're trying to do. I don't know.
Right, I think. Yeah, go on.
I don't know where you're studying logic or where I have failed to study logic. I'm sure I'll get some emails from people explaining this to me, but we're not going to make any headway on a syllogism that starts with if P, then not P.
I see. Okay, so we can leave that. I do think that is a valid a structure of an argument.
And you're wrong.
The logic that I have. Sure, we can. Okay, I was going to say we can differ about that, but I don't know if you would accept that.
Well, you'd be differing with Aristotle and logicians, as far as I can tell. But that would be a fallacious appeal to authority. So maybe you found the thing is. All right, go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to go on to.
Why does P suggest not P then? What is that?
That would be my premise.
Right. What is that?
My premise would be right. What do you mean? What is that?
What is your premise?
My premise is if P, then not P, where P stands for God exists.
Right. So can you expand on why you say that if P, then not P?
Sure. So at least according to what I learned in logic, the structure of the argument, which has one premise and one conclusion, the premise being P implies not P, and the conclusion being not P, that is a valid structure of an argument.
It would be a valid structure if it was if P then Q, but if P then not P is not fucking valid. It's a direct contradiction.
Okay, so let's move on. I think I've studied differently, but I don't think we should argue about that if we don't agree. I think that's okay.
Okay.
What I'm actually trying to get at is I have this idea of what I call the idealization principle. What I mean by the idealization principle is that when we come to define a specific term, we sometimes have some intuition of what the definition should be, but we're not exactly sure what the definition actually is. So we try to go by some guideline or our intuition of what that definition should be. So when we come to define the concept or the notion of God, I think we use this idealization concept.
So we're already at massive odds on this the second you say what a definition should be, because that sentence is antithetical to my understanding of language. Definitions are what they are. Dictionaries describe usage. Words are our tools to use however we want. And the only thing that matters, because they're tools for communications, is that if I use a word and I want V to understand it, V has to, at a minimum, understand what I mean by that word. To imply that there's some should related to definitions is the complete opposite of everything I would understand about language.
What I'm trying to say is, if I would come to define God as a physical human being, I think that would be wrong, because that would that would probably contradict the maybe the notion of God, the philosophical notion of God that I'm trying to get at.
Well, you're assuming that the philosophical notion of God you're trying to get at is the right one.
You're right.
This sounds like a turning, who was it, Aquinas on his head. So instead of saying because we can imagine a God, therefore God, you're basically saying because we can imagine a God, therefore no God.
Or worse, you're saying because people have defined God in a certain way, there is a correct definition of God, and anything that departs from that is an incorrect definition of God. And I get it. It's very similar to what I was talking about with somebody saying this can of Coke. But if you remember, what I said was, okay, I now understand that when you say God, you're referring to this soft drink. I just don't know why you would do that when it's so far removed from the normative use. It's not like there's a right version of the word peanut butter, but there's a normative usage in English language of what we mean by peanut butter. And if I held up this earbud case and said, for me, this is peanut butter, well, okay, now we could have a conversation where you would understand that every time I was saying peanut butter, hopefully, I was referring to this earbud case. And so now we've changed the usage for that term, but it is too specialized or too jargony because you and I are the only ones, and the people watching right now are the only ones who know that that's what I mean by peanut butter. And if we already have a word for this earbud case and a word for this soft drink, and the word we want to apply to those things is in a broad normative usage like peanut butter, then I would say it is a mistake to use it that way, not because it's the wrong definition, as if there's some right one, but because if your goal is to communicate, you are putting up barriers to effective communication because you're using language in a non-standard way. I'm not saying there's a right definition. And that's where I think I'm at odds with your right definition of God thing.
I see. So let me just try to. Okay, so what I usually do, as I said before, when I speak to someone about God, I usually ask them, "What do you exactly mean by God?" And then we get into the whole discussion of how do we define exactly God.
Yep, we're with you.
Right. So the end point where I usually get is that God must exist. That's what the other person would usually tell me, that existence must be one of the properties of God. And I know the problem with that idea of the
right. That comes from Anselm's ontological argument.
Anselm, that's what I was thinking of.
All right, and Kant had his own to do about the idea.
Yeah.
Right. So we could put that aside and let's assume that existence is a property just for now. What I usually try saying is that if you say that God is something that exists, then it seems not in line with what I called before the idealization concept. That I wouldn't want to say that God is a physical thing. I wouldn't want to say that God has any human attributes or something like that. So,
yeah, but why is it relevant what you would want to say about God?
Because I think that when we have a conversation about God, we both have, let's say not God, when we both have a conversation about peanut butter, we usually we have a certain idea of what peanut butter should be, but we're now just trying to define it. So if I would say peanut butter is, I don't know, black, that would seem to me wrong.
Okay, but
right?
I'm on board with all of that, and it's the thing that I just tried to explain a minute ago. But if I say to you, I believe in peanut butter, and you're like, peanut butter? You mean that stuff that we, mush up peanuts with oil and stuff, and we spread it on bread and maybe sometimes put jelly or whatever with it? I'd be, no, I mean this thing, peanut butter. Now, we can have a conversation for the rest of the day about whether or not you think this qualifies for the peanut butter label, and we won't be 1 millimeter closer to having an understanding of whether or not something exists. If somebody says that, oh, well, God is love. Great. I believe that love is real, at least in the sense of, brain states and emotions. And I would say I am fine with the notion of love. I'm just not fine with calling it God, and would explain why. And then if we sat there and argued about whether or not we should be justified in calling love God, we're never going to get to the real issue, which is, do you believe in a God that exists do I believe in the same thing you do, and are we both willing to call it the same thing? Because if that's the case, then you might as well, I mean, you're bilingual at least, right?
Excuse me, what was that?
You are at least bilingual, right? English isn't your first
Yeah,
language? You speak
Sure.
multiple
English is
languages.
my first language, but
So
I speak more than one language, yeah.
and I'm assuming the other one's Hebrew?
Sure.
Yeah, do you have more languages other than that?
No.
Okay. So what's the Hebrew word for peanut butter?
Timat butnim.
Tanakh Budmin?
Yep, something like that, yeah.
Okay. Why on earth would you and I ever have an argument about whether peanut butter should be called peanut butter or Tanakh Budmin?
You're right, we shouldn't.
And so the fact that we could do it within the boundaries of the same language is irrelevant, because every language is morphing. We can change it. There are words that I use in English that originate from other languages. Now we're talking about the labels and not the concepts. And all I care about is the concepts. I love the fact that you speak multiple languages. It's great to be able to talk to somebody who has a different lived experience from a different country, who, I mean, gosh, I wish I had more friends who spoke Hebrew. It'd come in handy very often when I'm going through Old Testament, Tanakh and Torah stuff, to say,
to call me.
Yeah, that would be useful. But what we're doing in that sense is translating one word to another, which is exactly what I've done when I label this as peanut butter. I've essentially created a new sublanguage, a derivation of English, where I have incredibly esoteric usages for things. It's like twins who create their own language, or when couples speak in code. And it's one of the things, my ex-wife's mother was deaf, and so I learned a little ASL, American Sign Language. And I didn't actually spend that much time, or as much time, talking to her mom in sign language as I would with Beth. And it was nice. And actually, the woman I'm dating now wants to be an ASL interpreter. And it's great because there's little things we can do if we don't want to disturb other people. That's an R. And so if you take both your hands like that and go, it's like, are you ready to go type thing. And so we can be at a party and I can go, and most people, well, now y'all will. But that's what we're doing in that language thing. And I don't know that it gets us any closer to having an understanding about whether or not a God exists. Does that make sense?
Right, so yeah, so I would agree with you that I'm not trying to talk about the specific words we use. I do think that people have a certain concept in their mind.
Well, now you're getting closer to suggesting that they're not being honest about what they're presenting. Is that fair?
No, I do think they're honest. I don't think people are lying, at least not to themselves. I just think that if they would think about it a bit more, and that sounds maybe a bit condescending, but that's what I do actually think.
It does sound condescending, but you may be correct that if I'm having a conversation with somebody about a God and they're coming back with kind of weird things that don't fit, I do doubt that they're accurately representing what it is that they truly believe, and instead might be parroting things that they think are easier to defend than what they actually believe. But rather than make the accusation, I'd like to ask the questions to get there.
Sure, right. So what I usually think is that people have this concept of God in their minds, and I think that if they would think about it a bit more, they would see that this concept cannot be an actual concept. And that's why I try using the thing I call the idealization concept or principle, that if you would try to attribute an existence to God, then you would probably contradict the concept of God that you want to have, or the concept of God that you believe.
And now we are where we were when you first presented if P, then not P. And remember I said that I was worried that there would be an equivocation fallacy in there? What you've just described is essentially if P, in brackets, then, or little p, then not big P. And there's a disconnect between the subject and predicate in there, where the P is the God they are defending, and the second P is the God that you're convinced that they actually think exists. And that's the flaw in the premise, is that you have two P's that are not the same thing. That's the equivocation fallacy. And so just restructure the argument to, instead of being if God, then not God, if God with property X, And then you can do a reductio ad absurdum to show that that God can't exist. And when they say, oh, that's not the God I'm talking about, now you've got them
Right.
able to talk about which God they are actually thinking of.
I see. Yeah. I like that. I will think about that. Can I just say 2 points before we finish? Is that
Sure.
okay?
Yes.
Okay. So the first one, I would ask you. I don't know if you have time. Do check the idea of the argument I gave, at least the structure of it. If P, then not P, and conclusion not P. I think that is a valid argument.
On Tuesday, I'm having
structure.
a hangout with a logician philosopher friend of mine. I'll bring that up.
Sure.
Matter of fact, Alex, if
second
you're
thing is
watching, remind me.
Great. Second thing is I just wanted to thank you. I've been following you for about 2 or 3 years. I think the first video I saw was the debate with you and Sai. Is it reasonable to believe in God? I think
It's amazing you watched anything else after that.
Yes, I watched that maybe 3-4 times.
Wow.
It was amazing. And
You're a masochist.
I think I think it was a difficult debate and difficult subject, but it was extremely interesting.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that.
Second thing is, sure. And the second thing is I just want to say thank you for coming out. I think you had a specific video about, you were talking about your relationship with your parents, about being an atheist.
Yeah.
So that really helped me with my relationship.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad it was helpful. Thank you.
Great. It was great talking to you guys.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Charlie. Sorry to walk all the way through that, but as soon as somebody starts digging in with a premise where I'm like, my immediate reaction
Right.
is, but that's a contradiction. And then it was clear.
Yeah, no, I love that kind of conversation. I'm all about that.